Okay, I accidentally ended the last video. I meant to pause it and I hit stop. So another thing I wanted to mention that goes along with the last video is this idea of feed-forward information, which I mentioned a little bit earlier. So homeostatic control can anticipate some changes to the internal environment and prepare the body for those changes. So a good example of feed-forward information would be that our sleep-wake cycle, which is what you're looking at. So the set point for both our body temperature and our melatonin concentration change based on the time of day, basically. The body begins to secrete melatonin in anticipation of going to sleep, and our temperature also drops, and our body does not recognize this as problematic, right? It doesn't say, oh my gosh, your set point for melatonin is all messed up, because we have this feed-forward information that our body knows, oh, okay, you know, on a daily cycle, we're going to have a different set point for this melatonin. Okay, so mostly in this section, I want to talk about homeostasis when it comes to thermoregulation, maintaining internal body temperature. So animals fall into two broad categories. They can either be regulators, where they use some kind of internal mechanism to control their internal temperature. So in other words, even if it gets cold, your body temperature doesn't drop to the same level as the environment. Or if it's really hot, like I mentioned, we walk outside on a 104-degree day, our body temperature doesn't shoot up to 104 degrees. We have internal mechanisms to keep that from happening. By contrast, a conformer allows its internal temperature to change with the external environment. So if it gets colder, then its temperature is going to get colder. I don't know if you've ever noticed this. If you go outside on a cool morning, insects are moving a lot slower, because if the external environment is cooler, their internal environment is also cooler, and that slows them down. So kind of along with a similar concept, animals either break down into being endotherms or exotherms. So in an endotherm, the heat source is metabolic. They create their heat through their metabolism. So birds and mammals would be endotherms. For an ectotherm, the heat source is external. So something like a lizard needs to raise its body temperature by sunning itself on a rock. It increases its internal temperature by using the external environment. So amphibians, snakes, turtles, fishes, and most invertebrates fall into this category. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about variation in body temperatures. Because the terms endothermy and ectothermy refer only to the source of heat, whether it's coming from metabolism or whether it's coming from the outside environment. And not all animals fall into such a neat category, and in particular, body temperatures can vary in some species regardless of their heat source. So we have some other terms that are useful. So a homeotherm is an animal where the body temperature remains relatively constant. Now these are normally endotherms, but think of maybe a fish that lives in water that is a very stable temperature. And so it's adapted to have its body temperature remain relatively constant, and it does remain relatively constant. So that could be an example of a homeotherm. There's also something called a poikilotherm. So this is when your body temperature can vary with the environment. So this is normally ectotherms, and we usually think of these as ectotherms, but there are some exceptions. What about a mammal that is hibernating? Like there are some bats that hibernate, and their body temperature can drop quite low with the environment, and they're fine. So we use this other, in addition to ectotherm and endotherm, a useful term is heterotherm. For animals that can modify their behavior and or their metabolism depending on their need. So which is better, endo or ectothermy? Well, it just depends. Endotherms use a lot of energy to keep their bodies at a consistent temperature, and the energy that they use for this thermoregulation isn't available for other things like growth, reproduction, or movement. So that's kind of a downside. Ectotherms, on the other hand, are more efficient, right? They don't need to use energy for thermoregulation, so that energy can be used for growth, reproduction, movement, etc. You know, on the downside, you know, they don't have this ability to control their own temperature, so they can be affected if their temperature gets too high or too low, and they're not able to, you know, get to an environment that is more stable for them. Why does it matter in the first place? You know, it matters in the first place because if our body temperature is not optimal, it means that our enzymes and other parts of our internal structures are not going to operate optimally and could even be destroyed. So it's really important that we have a stable body temperature. So changes in body temperature can cause malfunction in proteins. And one way that ectotherms deal with, you know, this dramatic change in their body temperature with environment is that they have what we call isozymes. And what that is are multiple forms of enzymes that have different temperature optima. So, in other words, when the snake gets really cold, a isozyme of a particular protein, it might have one variant that can function better in the cold than another variant can. And so, guess what it takes to build these enzymes, these isozymes? It takes extra energy. So, while the ectotherms don't have to spend a lot of extra energy regulating their temperature, they do have to spend some energy that endotherms don't have to spend making these isozymes. So it kind of, you know, just I think it really depends on the specific scenario what's going to be better. All right, so let's talk